All right, so moving right along, we're going to look at the next Irish modernist we're studying, James Joyce. And what Yeats accomplished with poetry, Joyce achieved with fiction, really even more so. Two of Joyce's three novels, he wrote one collection of short stories and three novels, so he didn't have a great amount of output in his life. But the influence and impact of what he did write cannot be understated. It's really unparalleled. Um, Two of his novels, Ulysses and The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, were on a list. The Modern Library Association did a list of the 100 best novels of the 20th century, and Joyce's Ulysses was number one, and his Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man was number three. The Great Gatsby sandwiched right in between. So I think that alone speaks volumes to the significance and the influence of Joyce. Um, we talked about how the modernist writers were very technical and experimental, experimented with new innovative narrative techniques. I don't think anyone achieved more than that than Joyce did. His other novel that was a little bit lower on that list, Finnegan's Wake, um, is arguably the hardest novel to read written in English. So that kind of gives you an idea, some insight into what Joyce achieved. Let's take a little bit of a look at his background here. He grew up in Ireland in a Catholic family, and so his early education primarily took place at Catholic schools of the Jesuit order. And his writing very much focuses on how at 16 he began rejecting his Catholic faith for a literary mission of rebellion and exile. So, kind of a breaking free of the religious order to explore the creativity in his fiction is one way to explain um, his early life and the transition into writing. For Joyce, being a writer necessarily implied a self imposed exile. So he lived abroad basically the majority of his adult life and felt that that was necessary to achieve his literary goals. Um, to preserve his integrity, to avoid involvement in popular causes, to devote himself to the life of the artist, he felt he had to go abroad. So he felt the connections were just too strong at home. He didn't want to get caught up in the Irish nationalist movement like Yeats did, even though he very much loved Ireland. He didn't want connections or anything like that to hold him back. He was a very self-focused individual. He wanted to immerse himself as much as possible in being a writer. So living somewhere other than where he grew up seemed necessary for that to him. Um, but he took the love of his life, Norna Barnacle, with him. They left Ireland in 1904 and never came back. They were together until the end of his life when he died in 1941, and they did get married in 1931. Throughout that time, they first lived in various places on the continent, and then they finally settled in Paris in 1920 and lived there for 20 years. And then in December 1940, just a few months before he died, they had to leave because of the start of World War I and Germany's invasion of France. So he lived the last few years of his life in Zurich. Um, Throughout his life, he suffered from eye diseases, hence the eye patch in the previous picture, and actually underwent 25 eye operations during his life. So that's just a little bit of his background here. One of the key things to take away from this is that he really believed in the self imposed exile. He lived in France, where there was a collection of expatriate writers from the US and England, should say Great Britain, meaning writers who had left their home country and decided to live there. So he was enmeshed in this literary community and oftentimes the focal point of it. Um, and so that was really helpful to his writing. But the key takeaway here is he felt that living abroad was necessary for his writing. So he was that into his writing. He was that dialed into the idea of just being an artist. But as you'll see on this next slide, he loved Ireland. and he always wrote about Ireland. Ireland was the only place he wrote about in any of his writing, even though he didn't live there as an adult. And so he was passionate about his country, but didn't want to get involved in his politics. And he was incredibly devoted to being an artist, but he took as the subject of his writing his home, even though his birthplace, I should say, rather than his home, even though he didn't live there as an adult. So that's what you should know about Joyce from his background. Moving into the ideas here in the literature. On the one hand, you have the specific and the local. Like I just said, everything he wrote about was in Ireland, but it has universal implications. The way the textbook says it is he found ways of expanding his accounts of the Irish capital so that they became microcosms of human history, geography, and experience. And what that means is, even though Joyce had a very local and specific setting, the troubles of Ireland at that time really represent the modernist condition. And as much as what his characters endure represent the struggles of Ireland at the time, even more so they represent the modernist conditions and the struggle of the modern man or woman. And so Joyce is this uniquely Irish writer, but at the same time, he's also like the voice of modernism, the figure most often associated with modernism. He's doing the specific or the local and the universal at the same time. So for Joyce, then, the question we might have is what is the modernist condition? What is the modern problem plaguing society? And that's paralysis. If you remember back to Yeats's poem, the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity, that's ironic. That's a reversal. Passionate intensity is a good thing. But what happens in modernity is people experience these sweeping changes. You have a paralysis of the will. You have people who are not passionate, who are not inspired. And that, to Joyce, is one of the greatest problems with the modern world. And that's part of what he addresses in his writing. Finally, here we have a really important term, epiphany. This is one of Joyce's main contributions to literary history, and it's an important concept, for a crucial concept for understanding his work. It's a dramatic but fleeting moment of revelation about the self or the world. So a character will have this incredibly important insight. It's brief, it only lasts a moment. But that insight they have that's about themselves or the world or both, often both, or we from it can have our own epiphany about the world as they learn about themselves. That ends up informing so much of the story, so much of it, so many of its themes. So keep that in your mind, the idea of an epiphany, as we study the dead here. So Joyce, as I mentioned, only wrote 4 literary works: a collection of short stories, Dubliners, from which The Dead comes. It's the last story in it. And then 3 novels: A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Ulysses, and Finnegan's Wake. And what his 2 most famous novels, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Ulysses, really do is use very modernist techniques, such as stream of consciousness, to explore the protagonist. Stephen Dedalus is the protagonist of both works, to explore his development as an artist, which parallels Joyce's own development as an artist. But while our textbook doesn't include A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, it's several hundred pages, so we don't have time to read it. So how does The Dead, the story we're about to look at, then help us understand Joyce and his major contributions to the literary world? Well, The Dead is the end of Dubliners. It's the last story in his short story collection. And there's an important transition where Dubliners was written in a very realist style, whereas A Portrait of the Artist and Joyce's subsequent novels were very experimental in the modernist tradition. What we have then is The Dead marks the transition from kind of a previous style that's more realist, almost more Victorian, to experimental modernist style. The Dead, then, as the last story in Dubliners, marks an important point in Joyce's development as an artist, as a writer. And one thing that's crucial to understanding Joyce is he makes his experience, the Irish experience, into the universal experience. So Joyce's development as an artist, his character's development as an artist, can help us better understand the modern condition and how Joyce grapples with it. So with The Dead, you have this story where there's this long party that deals a lot with Irish politics. And then you have in the final few pages a very personal moment between the protagonist and his wife where you learn something important about her past. And so that moment at the end of the story is the epiphany. And that's what we're going to study. We're going to look at passages just from the final page that reveal Gabriel Conroy's epiphany. And that epiphany is essential to understanding Joyce, to understanding Ireland, the 20th century, to understanding modernism, and to understanding what Joyce does as an artist to grapple with modernism. So we're going to take a look at Gabriel's epiphany in an effort to understand all those things. So what happens in the plot of the story is Gabriel Conroy and his wife go to this party where he has kind of all of these awkward interactions. The backdrop here is the Irish politics of the early 20th century, which we've already talked about as a time of turmoil, where Ireland is wanting its freedom from Britain and things are starting to ramp up. And Gabriel is seen as this figure who, by many of the people at the party, such as his aunts, is a well-liked figure among the family. And they want him to perhaps get more involved in Irish politics. And he has no interest in that. Like Joyce, he kind of wants to stay out of it. So he's a very passive character. He is, you could argue, dead to the world, dead to his emotions. He doesn't want to get involved. And so this party kind of goes on. And then after the party at home, he and his wife are together. And she confesses to him that when she was younger, she had a lover named Michael Fury, who was like the love of her life. And he waited outside in the cold for her for so long that he eventually died of hypothermia. And so this becomes this cataclysmic moment for Gabriel. It completely changes everything. He has all of these realizations in that moment when he hears the story from his wife. And so that's the epiphany. But what is his epiphany? What does he learn? What does he realize? That's what we're going to figure out by looking at these three quotes. So the first one says, Gabriel, leaning on his elbow, looked for a few moments unresentfully on her tangled hair and half-open mouth, listening to her deep-drawn breath. So she had had that romance in her life, a man who had died for her sake. It hardly pained him now to think how poor a part he, her husband, had played in her life. He watched her while she slept as though he and she had never lived together as man and wife. His curious eyes rested long upon her face and on her hair, and as he thought of what she must have been then, in that time of her first girlish beauty, a strange, friendly pity for her entered his soul. He did not like to say, even to himself, that her face was no longer beautiful, but he knew that it was no longer the face for which Michael Fury had braved death. So what's important here? A couple key phrases that jump out at me are that so she had had that romance in her life, a man had died for her sake. And then the phrase, it was no longer the face for which Michael Fury had braved death. The two things that are important about this is Michael Fury having a love for someone that he's willing to die for this woman. That is the complete opposite of Gabriel Conroy. Gabriel Conroy lacks that passionate intensity. But another key thing here is he also feels pity for his wife. You could expect a lot of things here. You could expect him to be jealous, and in the few pages leading up to this, it seems like he's going to get jealous when she first starts telling him about Michael Fury. But once he knows the truth of it, once he knows that Michael Fury died and why he died, he actually feels pity rather than jealousy for his wife. It hardly pained him now to think how poor a part he, her husband, had played in her life. a strange friendly pity for her entered his soul. And so he's able to move beyond himself. Gabriel, throughout all the interactions of the party, has displayed possessiveness and egoism. He's a very self focused guy. But once he knows the story, he's able to feel pity for his wife and sympathize with her. Um, he's moving beyond himself for the first time in the story in this moment. And what has inspired that? Someone who is willing to brave death for a great love. And so for Joyce, this type of moving beyond oneself, what the textbook calls neutrality, is the beginning of artistic awareness. Um, the artist wouldn't be able to achieve great art if they were still possessed by egoism and the desire to control things, to which Gabriel has earlier in the story. So let's keep going here and look at how this even more. The next paragraph I've selected says, generous tears filled Gabriel's eyes. He had never felt like that himself towards any woman, but he knew that such a feeling must be love. The tears gathered more thickly in his eyes, and in the partial darkness he imagined he saw the form of a young man studying under a dripping tree. Other forms were near. His soul had approached that region where dwell the vast hosts of the dead. He was conscious of, but could not apprehend, their wayward and flickering existence. His own identity was fading out into a gray, impalpable world. The solid world itself, which these dead had one time reared and lived in, was dissolving and dwindling. Really, the key line here is he had never felt like that himself towards any woman, but he knew that such a feeling must be love. This is the epiphany. Michael Fury has passionate intensity. Gabriel Conroy lacks passionate intensity. Michael Fury being aptly named with his last name there. So what Gabriel realizes is that he suffers from a paralysis of the will. We talked earlier in the background and context about that being one of the key aspects of the modern condition for Joyce. People not taking action, people being paralyzed, people not feeling anything, people becoming numb to the horrors of the world. We talked about the horrors of World War One. There's a moment in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway that we're not reading because it's too long to read in a class like this, though I wish we could, where this soldier who's in love with another soldier, his friend dies and he's troubled the whole story. And the revelation at the end is when he's thinking back to seeing his friend killed in battle, is that he loves this guy, but he feels nothing when he sees the guy die. And so part of the problem of the modernist condition is that people feel nothing. Why is there a failure to communicate? Why is there a disconnect between people? Well, the changes of the modern world, seeing people mowed down by machine guns, seeing technology being developed to more quickly, more precisely kill people, has stunted emotional connection between humans. And so Gabriel realizes in this moment, as he's displayed all throughout the party, and as we as readers have been able to see, that he lacks passionate intensity. He doesn't care for others. But when he hears the story and he hears that this guy was actually willing to stand out in the cold and die because he loved Gabriel's wife so much, that awakens something in Gabriel. That's the epiphany. He realizes he lacks passionate intensity. And that, as I said on the last slide, is this opening up that creates potential for much more for the artist. We're going to look at one more quote, the last passage of the story. A few light taps upon the pane made him turn to the window. It had begun to snow again. He watched sleepily the flakes, silver and dark, falling obliquely against the lamplight. The time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and farther westward, softly falling into the dark mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling, too, upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe and faintly falling like the ascent of their last end upon all the living and the dead. So this passage is famous for the snow here. What does the snow represent? That the great problem of modernity is paralysis. What this passage does through the snow is extrapolate out Gabriel's condition, his paralysis of will, and apply it to everyone in Ireland and also everyone in the modern world. So that the general kind of consensus is that many people are suffering from a paralysis of will, not just Gabriel. And the connection between the living and the dead. The dead is a metaphor for here. It's not just talking about people like Michael Fury who are literally dead. Michael Fury in his tombstone has more passion and intensity than the people who are alive. So the living are actually the dead. They're dead to each other. They're dead to their hearts, their emotions. They're dead to the suffering of the world. They're suffering from paralysis. And so Michael Fury's passion and intensity can be an inspiration then. It can wake people up, can wake them up to the fact that they are dead, and perhaps inspire them to live again. How would they live in this chaotic modern world? Through art. Which brings us to how this story, even though it lacks perhaps the narrative experimentation we would see in A Portrait of the Artist of a Young Man, that idea of passion and intensity in art brings us to how this story fits into Joyce's canon and how it shows us so much about what Joyce contributed to literature. At the end of this story, The Dead is a turning point and really the beginning for both its protagonist, Gabriel Conroy, and its author, James Joyce, because the epiphany Gabriel has at the end of the story reveals to him the modern condition, paralysis or figurative death. For Joyce, this kind of awareness is what one must possess to produce great art, which is important. It's the goal, really, because great art is the best response to the modern condition. The Dead, as the last story in Joyce's realist collection, Dubliners, stands out as a significant point of transition. From that point, Joyce would go on to write more experimental works that chronicle his journey as an artist through his protagonist, Stephen Dedalus' parallel journey as an artist and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man in Ulysses. So Gabriel Conroy is not an artist. But the kind of awakening, the kind of epiphany he has at the end of this story is what's necessary for the artist to achieve great art. And in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the protagonist has a similar epiphany that shows him, the protagonist in that is in Catholic school, much like Joyce. And his epiphany, he sees this bird-like woman, and it's his art he's going to create. And it's this very kind of modern art that's experimental. And so the epiphany in A Portrait of the Artist is what enables the protagonist, Stephen, to go on and do art. And so I think it's similar to what Joyce probably experienced when he realized he had to leave Ireland to be able to write effectively about Ireland, completely immersing oneself in the art. That's the epiphany for Joyce. That's the epiphany for Stephen. The epiphany for Gabriel is he's dead inside. He's paralyzed, not physically, but mentally, emotionally. And he needs the passionate intensity of Michael Fury, or at least is searching for it through art.